people are doing? So, been a while since we did this, and man, we are back with such a beautiful, beautiful bang. The Huawei Pura 80 Ultra. I mean, just take a look at this beautiful, polarizing, ridiculous camera module that we have here. Yes, it's a fingerprint magnet. They went for a glossy design. I don't know why. Just mysteries of the world. But the camera module is so insane in the best possible ways, because in my humble opinion at least, the worst thing for any smartphone in this day and age is to be boring. There are certain smartphones that are just going for the plain, simple, bland, boring, and I hate that. This I like. It may not be the finest looking camera module, may not be everybody's favorite, but that's just the way of the world. It's a good thing to be loved by some, hated by others. That's always nice, to say the least. The worst thing you want is to be unnoticeable or boring, right? But anyways, this is not a review for the design. No, this is a camera comparison, my photography comparison, and as you know, there are basically two things that you must bear in mind. First and foremost, this is the very first time that I'm using a Huawei flagship. Why is that important? Well, so far I have used other flagships like the Xiaomi 15 Ultra, and I've used other Xiaomi devices before. Same goes for Vivo, same goes for Samsung. So I know somewhat to an extent what to expect. There are always brand new features, especially with these Chinese flagships. But to this date, I've never had the chance of using a Huawei device, and bloody hell, I am so excited for that. It's just refreshing, to say the least. And of course, the second thing to bear in mind, almost forgot about that. Well, the format of the camera comparison is the same as before. Human subjects will be dealt with afterwards, in just about a week's time, give or take. Hopefully nothing bad pops up, but well, fact is that if I included human subjects, not only would it make this extremely long, it would also delay the entire video like a week, maybe a week and a half even, because it's just problematic, logistically speaking. So that's why I bifurcate these, and that way I can also focus on all of the juicy details. So let's get started. And as usual, we are kicking things off with the color profiles now. As you know already, the Xiaomi 15 Ultra has its Leica Vibrant, which is very good, it's very well balanced, and it works quite nicely, but there's something I prefer a lot more. We'll get to that. But the Huawei also packs three very distinct and different color profiles. So this is the original one, the regular one, which is good, and I think they're called X-image profiles or something like that, or is it X-image? Well, X-image sounds better, so we're just gonna stick with that. Now this right here, this is interesting. So Huawei says that the high contrast color profile, visually speaking, this is a higher contrast color profile. This is supposed to be vivid. See, now that doesn't make any sense to me, because vivid, in every traditional sense of the bloody word, it means to be vibrant, it means to be more saturated. And maybe, yeah, with the higher contrast, you get a little bit more saturation, that's just the way it works. But I don't know, I feel like maybe don't call it vivid, that's the best way to put it. Call it like high contrast, rich contrast, something like that. It would make a lot more sense. But well, that's just the way it is. Now, on the Xiaomi, of course, we have Leica Authentic, which, yes, it's inconsistent. Sometimes it'll desaturate, like in this case, it is actually desaturating. But it is still one of my all-time favorites in terms of just the stylish looks that we get. It's not going to be everyone's favorite. But then, of course, as you can probably tell, we also get a third color profile, which is called Bright. And it sucks balls. For a very simple reason. I mean, you can tell, it is just... there is basically no contrast, at least compared to the previous two shots that we saw. The original, I think, is the best balance that we have. The Bright is just not honestly worth using. Now, of course, for the sake of the comparison, we're just going to stick with the original on the Huawei. I think it gives you the most balanced, the most overall well-rounded looks. I'm going to test out a little bit more on the vivid color profile, as they like to call it. So what is the color science on the Huawei? That's what I've tried to figure out over here. And what I've noticed, quite simply, is that it's not going to be the most color accurate, it's not going to be the most accurate, low saturation, natural color profile, that sort of thing. It's not even trying to do that. It's fine, but I do wish that instead of that weird bright color profile, we had an actual natural colors color profile, something similar to Zeiss natural colors that we have on Vivo flagships. But well, that's wishful thinking. What we do get is actually very interesting and very nice. It is a very well balanced, slightly vibrant, very nice, rich, high contrast colors, and that's good. That's good stuff. There's no two ways about it. Now, personally speaking, I still prefer the Xiaomi because of simply the way it handles contrast. It pushes it to the limit but just pulls it back. In most cases, it's about as good as I could hope. Now, sometimes it will be inconsistent. That's just the way it is, because it's going for such a pushed look. it will suffer a little with inconsistency, but I'm happy to live with that. You might not be, so bear all that in mind. Now there is another interesting thing on the Huawei, so we actually can use 24 megapixel mode. Is it 24 or 25? I'm not entirely certain which one it was, but well, the fact is that we get high res, like semi-high res mode on the Huawei, very similar to what Apple does. And well, let's just say there's good news and bad news in that regard, because yes, you get more detail, you get significantly more detail than the Xiaomi. And as you know, Xiaomi is always known to just not sharpen their images whatsoever. They could benefit from a little bit of sharpening, to be very clear, because that zero sharpening approach doesn't always work out, especially with smartphone cameras. But Huawei is going to an extreme. Yes, their raw detail preservation is already higher than Xiaomi, but they are sharpening it a lot. That's not the best approach. Like, it's these two phones are perfect examples of polar opposite extremes. Like, you don't really want either of these results. You want something right in between. Slight bit of sharpening on the Xiaomi, or slightly less. Well, a fair bit less sharpening on the Huawei would yield a perfect result, but that's not really the case. But of course, bear in mind that was a 500% crop. It's a massive crop, to say the least. So in regular photos, like a lot of these cases, a lot of these backlit shots even, you're not going to notice any real issues, which is obviously very good news. In terms of dynamic range preservation, and it's not just dynamic range that is being preserved, it's also the way the sun is being handled, the way the highlight roll-off is being handled. The Huawei might be one of the best that I've used. Now, this is of course just the first camera compressor that I've got, so problems might emerge later on in various other circumstances. We don't really have all the data yet, but bloody hell, in this particular case at least, especially against the Xiaomi, the Huawei is just looking blockbuster. I mean, the way it is just bringing out the subtle warmth of the sunset sun and still just maintaining that beautiful roll-off, it's still maintaining the colors perfectly. This is exactly what I would want in terms of a backlit image. This is about as good as it can get. But now with the ultra-wide camera, so yes, as you can probably tell without me even zooming in, there's definitely some bit of sharpening happening, especially like take a look at the bricks on the road and everything else. All of those textures are really popping out. That's because of sharpening. It's not because the Xiaomi is just not preserving as much detail. The Xiaomi just refuses diligently to sharpen. Sometimes it's a good thing, most of the time not really. But the Huawei, again, it does go to an extreme in most cases, even with good daylight conditions. And now, in case you're wondering, we don't really get that semi-high res option. It just doesn't exist with the ultra-wide camera. It's not the end of the world. To be entirely honest, it barely makes a difference, especially with the high amount of sharpening that we have. You're not really going to be cropping in anytime soon on the Huawei. Now, sometimes, however, it can oversaturate the sky. This is something I've noticed. I don't know if turning off the AI processing on the Huawei will help or not. I have to test that out. But I do think that in many cases, that sky looks nuclear and obviously not how it naturally looked. But everything else, like the depth of the colors, the way they are handled, it's genuinely speaking, beautifully done. On both phones. I still, again, prefer the Xiaomi 15 Ultra because, higher contrast, although I must say the contrast between these two is very, very close on both. It's actually the slightly more natural colors that we get on the Xiaomi in most cases that I prefer that much more. Now, there are certain situations, like this backlit shot. This is what I like about the Xiaomi. You might look at it and be like, oh, it's not really exposing the shadows. It shouldn't be exposing the shadows. This is a completely backlit shot and the Xiaomi looks perfect. The Huawei very obviously looks processed. It's trying to bring out the shadows and just, bring out detail and contrast in the shadows. The over sharpening is very obvious, and that's where the Xiaomi's processing is just something I really like. Now, obviously, I'm not going to just leave you guys hanging here, in case you were wondering about the detail preservation. Now, this is slightly backlit. Well, no, this is completely backlit, but the sun is kind of behind the structure, the fountain structure here. So this is about as challenging as a situation can get. So let's crop in and see exactly which one's got the better detail preservation here. And well, just as expected, the Xiaomi comes in with zero sharpening. But also notice how the Huawei, it has a lot of sharpening. It's very obvious, like the haloing, the artifacting is just all over the place, but it doesn't actually give us more detail than the Xiaomi. The Xiaomi looks very naturally, beautifully detailed. This is a heck of a shot, I must say, like especially with detail preservation, given that it's slightly backlit. This is about as good as it can get on the Xiaomi. Speaking of getting things to be as good as they can get, we get telephoto macro, thank the gods, on both phones. None of that ultra-wide crap, because let's face it, at this point it's been made painfully clear to everybody on the planet that ultra-wide macro is just not good enough. telephoto macros with just how insane and high quality telephoto cameras can get. The insane part is very obvious on the Huawei here. We'll get to that in a moment, but I must say, having telephoto macro is just so very nice. And I would say that both are performing equally well. Neither of these would win any awards in terms of how close you can get to the subject, but the colors. You might be thinking the Xiaomi is the one that's accurate. It's not, actually. We had a yellow light, not a warm light, a yellow light in the scene, and the Xiaomi is very obviously overcompensating for it. Also, take note of just how much depth of field we have. Like, we already see some background bokeh and blur happening on the Xiaomi, but it's even more prominent on the Huawei, which is quite something, because that just showcases how massive that sensor is that Huawei is using. However, let us finally talk about zoom, because let's face it, that's what we're here for. The Huawei brings out its cutting edge, its bleeding edge zoom capabilities, and well, before we get to that, let's first just hash out the 2x situation here. And well, it's exactly as you would expect. The Xiaomi has no sharpening, the Huawei has way too much, and that's, well, I don't think any of us expected anything different in this very situation, so let's move on. Because now, ladies and gentlemen, we have the 3.7x on the Huawei, which, as we saw already, massive sensor, versus a 3x on the Xiaomi, which I would not say it's particularly good. It's a fine sensor, it's an alright sensor. It's not particularly good. And well, cropping all the way in, I would say it's good on the Xiaomi. It's got a lot of good detail preservation without any sharpness once again, but you know, if there was a little bit of sharpness, it would be the perfect image. The Huawei, just as you would expect, even with such a massive sensor, if there's over sharpening, it's just going to destroy the image, and that's kind of what's happening. It's not a bad shot, but when you crop into 500% and you see this much haloing, sharpening, artifacting, all that jazz, it's really just, it's disheartening, to say the least. If they take it down a few notches, you're going to get perfect results, because this is just going way too overboard with the sharpening. Now, of course, at 4.3x, I think it's pretty obvious that Xiaomi is the one that has the optical zoom advantage here. It has a really nice sensor, 200 megapixels even. Of course, that's not what we're using, but one thing I gotta point out, the colors just, they look kind of off. There's way too much magenta on the Xiaomi 15 Ultra, which is kind of unfortunate, because the Huawei is doing a bang-up job with the colors. They look basically perfect. And cropping all the way in, I think we kind of expected this one. Like, it's very obvious that the Huawei with the digital zoom is not really going to keep up with pure optical that we get on the Xiaomi. Even though, once again, Xiaomi is not really sharpening all that much, it's still doing a much better job as opposed to the Huawei. But then, of course, Huawei comes in and kicks it up a gear, because now you're using that insane mechanism that we have inside, where essentially the prism will shift to a different lens structure, and that'll essentially allow us to use the same exact sensor as a 3.7x for a 9.4x zoom. Now, as per the viewfinder, we are actually using 10x. That's the toggle we have, which, and I kind of get it. It's a rounded up number, and 10x just sounds nice. And I guess, you know, even without zooming in, I can tell already, the detail level on the Huawei is just sky high. Is it perfect? No, not really. It still has the slight bits of oversharpening. I do think that the overall oversharpening is slightly less in case of 9.4x as opposed to the 3.7x shot we saw before, but it's still very much present. Now, I also took a 30x shot on both phones, and well, the point is that even at 30x, the Huawei without question does a better job. Like, yeah, you could zoom in and you're gonna get a lot of sharpening in there without question, but at the end of the day, with long range zoom, you're definitely gonna get much better results when it comes to Huawei, even with the oversharpening. But that is obviously not where we end, because we also get high res on every single camera on both of these smartphones, and actually multiple high reses on the Xiaomi. We'll get to that. But first, as usual, with the main camera, 50 megapixels. It's not supposed to be a ton of difference, you know, I can kind of expect some sharpening on the Huawei, but anything more than that, I don't know if anyone's really expecting much. But the reason I say that is because with high res, somehow the processing, it just works. I'm not really seeing a ton of sharpening here. There's definitely a little bit, without question. At 500% crop, I can see some sharpening on the Huawei, but man, it is miles ahead of whatever the Xiaomi is producing, because that, like, it doesn't even look like the Xiaomi is using high res. That's how big of a difference we're seeing here. This is quite some. This is the most surprised I've been by the Huawei. The high res is a hidden MVP, and I didn't even realize that until right now. So what about the ultrawide camera? Because as we already know, high res in particular, not particularly good on the Xiaomi 15 Ultra. It's never been its strong suit. So especially when it comes to indoors lighting, does the ultrawide really suffer on the Xiaomi? And yeah, kind of, because the Xiaomi doesn't want to sharpen, so naturally you don't really get a whole lot of detail. However, I think that Xiaomi still takes the win. Why, you may ask? Because if you look closely on the Pura 80 Ultra's image, basically you have these weird patches where the processing didn't properly sharpen or bring out details, or something or the other weird happened that is, you have these weird blurry patches in there where you just have no detail, and then right beside those you have sharpness happening. So this is like a significant issue, and by the way, this happened 2 to 3 times out of the 5 shots that I took, so I really wanted to showcase that issue here. It's very obvious and very significant. But then of course we have 3.7x. Now, oddly enough, we get 50 megapixel mode on the Pura 80 Ultra, which is cool, like obviously you want that, but you don't get the 50 megapixel mode with the 9.4x. So this is the highest that you can have with regards to high res, and it's good high res. It is one of the highest quality high reses that I've seen in a very long time. Just look at the depth of field we are getting with the 3.7x sensor, as opposed to the Xiaomi, which again is not a horrible sensor that we have, but it doesn't even compare. Like the high-res quality doesn't even compare. We get basically no depth of field, and that should really give you a visual representation of how much larger the sensor is on the Huawei. However, oddly enough, even though it's the exact same sensor that is being utilized by the 9.4x, we don't get access, basically. Like it's software limited, the access to high res on the 9.4x. But of course we have complete access to high res with the 4.3x on the Xiaomi. That's the high res is kind of the whole point of the Xiaomi's 4.3x, even though it's not particularly good. Because as you can probably guess, even at high res, the Xiaomi, its processing just doesn't work well with high res. Somehow it just doesn't work out. I would say that regular 12 megapixel daylight images, the daylight zoom shots that we saw previously, those were much better and much more comparable to what the Huawei is producing. Not sharpened as usual, but still much more comparable. You just don't see the jump in quality you want with high res on the Xiaomi. And that stays completely true even at 200 megapixels, which is really sad because the 200 megapixels is supposed to be, it's gimmick. Like that's what you get when you buy the Xiaomi 15 Ultra. But you don't. That's kind of the issue here. Like yeah, it's a good sensor. It works out really well in most cases, the 4.3x, but the 200 megapixel mode, just completely worthless. Very sad. However, what isn't sad on the Xiaomi 15 Ultra is night mode, because the Xiaomi 15 Ultra has by far one of the best and one of my all-time favorite night modes at the very least. The way it handles nighttime images, the contrast balance and everything else, especially with the Leica authentic night mode, it's beautiful. It's a chef's kiss right there. Huawei on the other hand, it takes a slightly different approach, as you would have guessed. Now once again we get all 3 color profiles on the Huawei, although I don't really see much of a difference. Maybe slightly higher contrast with the vivid color profile. Once again, why would you call it vivid? But well, that's an argument for a different day. But yeah, with the vivid color profile you get slightly higher contrast, but my problem, as you can probably guess at this point, is the night sky. It just doesn't look like a night sky. That's way too blue. No night sky looks like that. But to be completely honest, when I was taking regular night mode shots, this is like city night mode shots, so it's not particularly dark, but there are a lot of like light sources all over the place, so HDR needs to be exceptionally good because there's a lot of shadows to expose, a lot of highlights to suppress, so on and so forth. And in that regard, both phones are handling things tremendously. I would say that the colors in most cases and dynamic range is actually better on the Huawei as opposed to the Xiaomi, which is very impressive. Now, overall, I still think that the natural nighttime look is being maintained much better by the Xiaomi, especially when you have any kind of night sky involved, because the night sky just gets so bloody blue. It's just, case in point right here, it's trying to increase the saturation of the night sky so damn much, it's getting artifacted. Like, this is a really horrible shot on the Huawei. It's one of the few failures that we have seen so far on the Huawei, but it really goes to show. Maybe don't make the night sky so blue. But again, outside of that, especially when lots of colors are involved, maybe like, warm lights, blue lights, red lights. Like, I was in City Walk and man, this place is colorful. And in most of those cases, I actually noticed that the Xiaomi was kind of struggling with the saturation in general. It's just not really able to bring out all the beautiful colors that we had over there. But the Huawei, it just unleashes itself. And because we have so many light sources, we don't really get that obnoxious, weird blue night sky in many of these cases. Only some of them had that crazy problem, but every other scene in many of these cases, like the white balance is better on the Huawei, the colors are being represented really nicely on the Huawei, it's very pleasing. Maybe a little oversaturated in certain cases, but in most cases, very, very pleasing. So I guess, in a manner of speaking, in a lot of these cases, the Xiaomi is not performing as well as the Huawei. I guess the best way to put it is that both phones have their own sets of very different problems, because, and this also applies to the ultrawide camera as you would expect, but well, on the Xiaomi 15 Ultra I'm noticing that the colors are very natural, very authentic, very realistic. That's just the way it goes for. And it works out tremendously well in most cases, maybe not so much in others. It really depends on the scene that you're shooting. And that is also very true for the Huawei, because in a lot of cases I've noticed that the colors, especially when it comes to any kind of lighting, any kind of saturated lighting, like the red lights in some of these cases, it is represented so much better on the Huawei. Like the Xiaomi is completely like failing at bringing the reds out and just giving them the proper saturation levels. It just doesn't work out on the Xiaomi. So it's really a toss-up with regards to like what you're shooting is gonna determine which one's gonna pull ahead. So I'm kind of glad I went to City Walk for this, because otherwise I would not have, come to this realization. Now with that said, we are at the home stretch now. Zoom at night. So starting up with the 2x, and once again, I have to point this out, colors look so much nicer, so much more realistically saturated on the Huawei, in this particular case especially. The sky looks horrible, without question, but the overall colors of everything else looks much nicer. I just wish we could have the sky from the Xiaomi. Perfect image on the Huawei, if that was the case, but it's not really. But cropping in all the way, actually, weirdly enough, there's no sharpening on the Huawei. I did not expect that. The Xiaomi is performing exactly as I expected. It's got a lot of smoothening because it's doing the noise reduction, but it's not really sharpening anything. Very similar case on the Huawei. I would say that the details look kind of weird and artifacted in certain cases, like this aliasing that I can see on the Huawei. But yeah, overall I'd say that the Xiaomi takes a slight win. Now with the 3x, you might be noticing very different colors on both phones. Can you guess which one's more realistic? It's the Huawei, of course. I just, like, this is the pinnacle of what I've been complaining about when it comes to colors at night. There was warm light in there. It's all gone, like entirely taken out. Xiaomi has basically done a perfect job at failing to capture the realistic colors. Bravo, I guess. But anyways, let's crop all the way in, and I think this was obvious. I get it, this is not the perfect subject for this, but still, it's very obvious that the Huawei is the one that not only has the natural colors, but also has much more realistic detail in there. There's a little bit of sharpening for sure, but the overall detail preservation, much higher, especially if you look at the edges on both phones, way higher on the Huawei. Now, at 4.3x, now this is a very good subject because there's a lot of fine detail in there that we can zoom into. And well, once again, just side note, the colors, so much nicer on the Huawei, aren't they? But of course, cropping all the way in, and see, this is 4.3x, which previously at daytime, it didn't really perform all that well on the Huawei, at least in comparison to the Xiaomi. But now, with the way the sharpening is being processed, which by the way, I have to say, this is one of the most natural, well-balanced amount of sharpening that we have on the Huawei. There's just no two ways about it. It looks very nice, minimal amounts of haloing. There's some haloing obviously, but still, at 500%, like this just looks good. It doesn't look unnecessarily over sharpened, as we saw with many images. So, there's hope. If Huawei can bring this to every other image that we had in this comparison, well, perfection. But of course, we cannot forget about the 9.4x. Oh well, technically it's the 10x that we're using on the Huawei. And well, even without zooming in, I can tell it's just so much more detailed on the Huawei. And well, case in point, yes, there's some amount of smoothening going on, and once again, the sharpness is being handled really well. I'm honestly surprised by how well sharpening is handled at night as opposed to daytime. And with that said, hot damn, this is going to be such a long video. Even though we don't have human subjects, there's so much that we talked about. But one thing that I completely forgot to mention is that there are basically two major issues that I just completely skipped my mind, because I was so excited to see the results that I just completely forgot about the problem. So, when I was capturing night mode shots, by default, the Huawei would use a 2-second exposure. Doesn't matter how much light you have, like the Xiaomi would take an instant exposure, like half a second of exposure, and be done with it. The Huawei, 2 seconds every time, mandatory. And actually, if you do end up shaking, you would get motion blur, which makes no sense. Like, it doesn't need the long exposure. What is it even exposing for? I don't know. Like, the quality is very much similar in many of these cases that we saw at night, especially. So I don't know. I don't understand exactly what it is that Huawei is exposing for. Like 2 seconds, 3 seconds in many cases. It's way too much. We don't need that. It's unnecessary and it's a hassle, and it's very annoying when you have to capture as many samples as I have to. Speaking of high resolution, it was fairly nice and impressive on the Huawei without question. The end result was impressive. The process, however, can you guess what the problem was? Oh baby. Each and every single one of the high-res shots, broad daylight high-res shots that I took in many of these cases, they required, drumroll please, 3 full seconds of exposure for each and every one of them. Can you imagine? 3 seconds exposure for a 10x shot. Well, no, technically, no, I'm sorry. 10x, we don't even get high-res with that. Maybe that's why, but who knows. However, for every single other shot that I took, main camera high-res 3.7x, all of them required 3 seconds. It was painful. The most annoyed that I felt when taking high-res shots. Just, I don't know why that exists, but it does. It makes zero sense to me. Just, I don't know. There's no two ways about it. It just, I don't know what it is that is exposing for. Like, how much light do you even need? It's broad daylight. You don't need any long exposure. Anyways, ranting aside about that, I think that overall, Huawei's got a lot of potential. Like, I had slightly lower expectations here as opposed to what we saw before. So yeah, the end results, apart from the weird exposure problems that we have, the long exposure problems, I would say pleasantly surprised in many cases. The sharpening is the biggest issue that I have, and the blue night sky. Those two aside, everything else, they look really nice, and honestly, I'm very impressed. And without question, I cannot wait for the comparison between the Huawei Pura 80 Ultra and the Vivo X200 Ultra. I'll see you then. Cheers.